Please join me in welcoming Sasha Senderovich.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I don't know what they were expecting with this giant hall. Usually this is my maybe fourth time giving a talk about the book since it came out. Usually I'm very surprised to see, if they're half the people in the audience that I know, I understand that they come because they know me, but then I'm always surprised by the other half. So I'm very pleased by the proportion. I do know a couple of people, but most of you I don't know. So I appreciate that you're here, even though we definitely, the capacity is for something that I could never imagine as a turnout. And thank you so much for introducing me, Natan, and to Mario for organizing things. It's lovely to be here. I've only been here for about 24 hours, and I've already met people that I hadn't met before that are just wonderful to get to know. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes. I'm not going to read from notes. I'll read a little bit from the book, but I'll mostly just sort of talk and show you some slides. I can't control them myself, so I'll have Natan as my assistant, so you will occasionally hear, next slide please. I don't know exactly where they are. There might be a little bit of a glitch here and there, so I ask you to excuse me if that happens. When the book came out in the summer, it's an academic book. And academics, we live in our heads for a long time, and we don't know when the book is, if anybody's going to read it besides our colleagues. So I knew that the book was maybe on a good, track when this happened. Next slide, please. On Twitter, where I'm participate sometimes, a man who calls himself the Bath Man, and whose account is at Bath Time Reading, I believe, I can't remember what it is, somehow got hold of my book and tweeted a picture of himself in what I later understood to be his usual setup. He lives in Newfoundland. I don't know who this is. It's not somebody who staged it. His entire account is dedicated to photographing himself in this elaborate Bathman setup in his bathtub with the books that he's reading. And he has a very eclectic taste, so somehow he learned of this book. So when I saw that the Bathman had picked up my book, I thought maybe a few people would read it who are not my colleagues. So this is kind of where the journey of this book post-publication began. But the story starts also, of course, with the cover. Natan, next slide, please. So I wanted to show you the kind of rejected cover for the book. It seems that when you are publishing a book on a topic that deals with the Soviet Union, and especially the 1920s and the 1930s, the choice of colors is red and black. The editor really wanted to make sure that the red isn't missed, so the title of the book was turned into a banner, right, to make sure that you understand that this is about communism. Next slide, Natan can show you how this is the color palette for the books in the field. They're kind of overwhelmingly, it seems like you don't have a choice. So I begged them to please not use so much red. So we ended up with the cover of the book. So I just want to tell you about this photo, what I know about the photo. A colleague of mine, I'd queried some colleagues what they imagined should be on the cover of the book. And one colleague said, you need to have a photo of a Soviet Jew making something. Since the book is How the Soviet Jew Was Made, the title means to pun on a kind of Soviet-era production novel, how the steel was tempered, sort of thinking of that kind of pun. So the press found this photo, which is, as far as what I can tell about it, is taken maybe around 1923 or 1924. This is a collective of hat makers. So you can see them with their tools of trade, posing clearly for a picture, and they're from Skvira, Ukraine. So you can see this on their banner behind them. Most of the banner is obscured, and I can't really tell exactly what they're photographing themselves for, but as far as I can piece it together, it's some kind of a relief fund that's organized in the town of Skvira, possibly for the victims of pogroms of the recent Russian Civil War at the time. I can't really tell, but it's some kind of a communal fundraiser. And another banner behind them is in Yiddish. So you can see one is in Ukrainian that says that they're in Skvira, and the other one is in Yiddish. And I can't make out all the words either, except for Ratenmacht, Soviet power, right? So there's some kind of a Soviet slogan that's behind them, and the little portrait above them is Lenin. Kind of very subtle, not particularly visible. And obviously the red was the compromise with they wanted to colorize the photo, so it gives you kind of Schindler's List sort of association, which is not what I was going for, but they sort of decided to colorize it. But it's kind of gives you a sense of people that I'm trying to write about, and they look differently from each other. You can see a man with a beard and a hat, who is possibly more observant. You can see people who are dressed differently, but sort of different ages. And also all men, but I'll talk about that in a minute. I wanted to kind of give you a sense of what the book is by starting out just reading the first page of the introduction. The academic writers struggle to write well, and we try to sometimes kind of do it as well as we can so that it's readable. So I put a lot of work into the first couple of pages especially, but more than that as well, to try to kind of get a sense to the reader of what the book is about. So I just wanted to give you a sense, and I'll read a page and then I'll go back to talking without reading from the paper. So if you could turn to the next slide, please, Nathan. I'll have a quote for you that you could look at if you wanted to. In Isaac Babel's 1932 short story, The End of the Almshouse, set in Odessa during the period of violent unrest between 1918 and 1921 that came to be known as the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks expel a group of old Jews from a poorhouse located on the grounds of one of the city's Jewish cemeteries. The poorhouse was a charitable institution of the sort that had made Jews in the Russian Empire a self-sufficient communal entity prior to 1917, when the Tsarist regime fell in February and Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in October. Now, with the dissolution of the community structures, the elderly become displaced. The heat tormented the heap of rags that was dragging itself across the earth, the narrator notes in the story final lines. The road lay along a joyless, scorched and stony highway, past wattle-and-up shanties, past fields choked by stones, past bombed-out houses, past the Plague Hill. Once upon a time in Odessa, this inexpressibly melancholy road had led from the town to the cemetery. Jolted out of place by the upheaval of the revolution and no longer able to live out their days in peace, the elderly Jews find themselves on the road. This road, stretching past buildings recently ravaged by violence and alongside a century-old burial mound that contains the bodies of victims of a much earlier disaster, Odessa's 1812 plague epidemic, is said to have, quote, once upon a time, когда-то in Russian, linked the city with the cemetery, indicating 1920-1929 as the time span of the composition at the bottom of the text itself. Isaac Babel published The End of the Almshouse in 1932, more than a decade after the events described in the story. In the story, the road appears suspended in time and place, as though no longer leading where it once did. Moreover, he writes, the road, doroga ich in Russian, or given another meaning of the noun in Russian, the journey of theirs, is not just a physical space, which the writer calls a highway, chassé, in the same sentence, but also the displaced Jews' trajectory to destinations unknown. As the story's language turns the group of older Jews into a heap of rags, gruda lachmutiev. The people begin to resemble the disintegrating clothes, reminders of a faraway place that managed to persist. So what happened to Babel's heap of rags last seen moving along a road and suspended out of time. Perplexed by the open-ended conclusion of the end of the almshouse, I began to follow the remnants of a once-rooted culture scattered across the landscape of Bolshevik Russia, and after its formation in 1922, the Soviet Union in the first 2 decades after the revolution. I traced this proverbial heap of rags, defined by its many idiosyncrasies, as it was dispersed from its origin points in Ashkenazi Jewish communities of the Russian Empire's western borderlands, and through the subsequent encounters with the USSR's stated ideological and cultural program, building the world's first multi-ethnic society united by the common aim of equality under communism. I came to understand the heap of rags here not as a pejorative term, but as a shorthand for the collection of habits, practices, and cultural tropes associated with the defunct empire's Ashkenazi Jews that were appended by the revolution but did not remain behind and die off in the old world. Instead, personal characteristics, worn-out possessions, disaggregated bits of culture, and uprooted customs carried on across the landscape of the Soviet experience. Along the way, these bits of culture encountered and were modified by new ideological messages and structural pressures. The Soviet Jew, the layered, indeterminate, and fluid figure that emerged from this alchemy, remained in perpetual motion. And in this book, I try to outline this figure's contours. I wanted to talk about how I do this very quickly, to give you a couple of, examples from what the book is dealing with, and then give you one kind of quick in-depth look at one of the examples that to me is the most illustrative in many ways, and also the most kind of rewarding in terms of research. So I first wanted to show you the map. So Nathan, if you don't mind. I worked with a map maker to try to do a map for the book that captures a couple of different things, including different trajectories of different stories that I trace in the book, but to mainly also show its main kind of intention. So what you see is in the shaded area, the darker gray, both on the large map and also on the inset, on the big map, is the Pale of Settlement. Right? So this is the map familiar to many people, the map of the borderlands, of the western borderlands of the Russian Empire, where Jews had to reside between the late 18th century and 1917, the February Revolution of 1917, when the Pale of Settlement was abolished and Jews gained equal rights in the Russian Empire, and then in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union maintained those rights. So this territory, it doesn't exist after 1917. That is, the place exists, the land is there, but this legal entity is gone. So I'm interested in the moment starting in 1917 when the Pale of Settlement is no more, but it continues to persist in various ways, right? In the minds of people, in terms of their practices, in terms of their ways of associating with the places that they're from. So what I wanted the map maker to show is to overlay the map of pre-1917 concentration of Jewish population onto the map of Europe and the Soviet Union after the revolution and the First World War, right? So what you can see in the inset is state borders, right, cutting across a space that used to be existent in a kind of contiguous political space. The Soviet Union is now part of it, but also there's a new independent state of Poland. There's Baltic states up in the north. And you can see on a smaller map, right, the way that this sort of fits in as well. So in many ways, what I try to do in the book is to try to think about the persistence of this map through the first 20 years after the Bolshevik Revolution. When the Pale of Settlement is gone, Jews could live anywhere, they do, but there's still this kind of continued lingering presence. I do it in a couple of ways, right? So I want to talk about the time frame of the book and also languages that I need to work with and also kind of the way the translation plays into it. So the time frame is that I think about 1917 as the origin point, and I end in the late 1930s. So the book is about 20 years. Sometimes I joke that if I go on to write more books about Soviet Jews, there'll be sequels. Right, there'll be how the Soviet Jew was made, part 2, part 3. There's kind of a lot of different periods to work through, but I wanted to do a really kind of in-depth concentration on 20 years. Why those 20 years? A couple of reasons. So if you go back to this map, right, you can think about the time frame as being delineated by this map. So the beginning is the end of the Pale of Settlement, 1917. The end is 1939, right, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which revisits the same lands, right, and redraws the boundaries once again. And there's another genocide, right, that sort of unfolds in those same lands, once again, with the continued Jewish presence. So that's a separate story that needs a separate book, and there are many books, of course, and there are many that need to be written as well. But for me, that's the end point of this story, of how the Soviet Jew was made in the beginning. Other kind of marker you could think about is histories of violence. So if the end marker, right, the late 1930s, is the beginning of the Second World War, the beginning is the pogroms that followed after the Russian Civil War, or during the Russian Civil War, right after the revolution. So there's violence between 1918 and 1921. Different estimates of maybe 100,000 Jews killed. They vary differently. So you can think about this as opening with one kind of violence and ending with another. And then there's also kind of a really interesting bit that I realized when I was writing this, is that for many American Jews, Jews in the West, there is a certain notion of what a Soviet Jew is that stems from the Cold War history and the Cold War experience of the Soviet Jewry movement. And I assume that that's familiar to many of you, right? The sort of the participation of American Jews in the movement to save Soviet Jews, that conceived of Soviet Jews in a particular way, in the way that was framed by the Cold War understanding of the Soviet Union itself. In many ways, that understanding relied on the understanding of Jews as a so-called passport nationality. Right? So in the Soviet Union, people of different ethnicities had their ethnicities written down on their passports. So if somebody was Jewish, they were identified as Jewish. If they were Ukrainian, they were identified as Ukrainian in their official documents, etc. And in the later Soviet period, that became often the kind of reason for discrimination. The common misconception here is that passport nationality didn't exist until the late 1930s. The Soviet internal passport was introduced in 1932. It had nothing to do with Jews. It was introduced so as to keep Ukrainian peasants tethered to collective farms into which they were forcibly herded so that they couldn't leave them. And the ethnicity line, the line about people's origins, was introduced later in the 1930s and became kind of important in 1938, not because of Jews, but because of Poles. The Soviet Union became obsessed with a possible attack from Poland. So ethnic Poles needed to be tracked, right? So the end of my time period is the kind of codification of Jewishness in a legal sense, right? As a nationality that could be identified to Soviet authorities, but it's not yet the case in the first 20 years, so there's fluidity. Right? And you can think about the making of the Soviet Jew as a process that's complex and involves many things. So that's the time frame. The second issue for me is languages. I'm a literary scholar, and the book, I'm kind of became more of a cultural historian, I suppose, trying to really read literary texts in their context together with various historical documents. And I do this by reading about half of the material in this book was originally produced in Yiddish, right, the language of the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews in the Russian Empire right before 1917, but also the language that continued to play a very large role in the first 2 decades after the revolution. And then another half was produced in Russian. And here I think of Russian as a language associated with Soviet state power, right? So that's the dominant language. And I think about the interplay of the two languages in the way that I write about them as not separately Yiddish and Russian, but as of the text that I work with as always already Russian/Yiddish or Yiddish/Russian. There's some kind of interplay of the two languages in the texts that I think about, and that makes me think about translation as a really important mode with which to encounter these texts. So translation both is a way of thinking of something that already exists in more than one language from the beginning. So for example, I write a chapter about Isaac Babel, who writes in Russian, the major Russian language Soviet Jewish writer, but who has kind of Yiddish in his ear and in the background of his Russian, and a lot of his Russian could be understood as a kind of already translation of the Yiddish. So I try to kind of think about that. And for me also translation is important because, as Natan said in his generous introduction, I also translate. And part of the story of writing this book was procrastinating and not writing it by translating the texts that I went on to write about, right? So I ended up writing a chapter about a novel that hadn't been translated into English, that I translated together with a colleague, another novel that was edited. So I really think about this book as existing alongside other books that should be on people's bookshelves, people who are readers of Jewish texts, who should pick up these other Yiddish novels, these other kind of Russian language Soviet novels, and to which my book maybe could introduce them for the first time. So there's a bigger set of texts than my own that I'm feeling sort of responsibility for. And what this book doesn't do, and this is slightly academic at this point, but I'll try to make this distinction in a way that I think is really important for me. I'm not the first person to write about literature written by Jews in the Soviet Union or Jews in Russia. I follow in the footsteps of many colleagues and I engage with their work. One place where I draw a really kind of strong distinction is that often the concerns had been about writing about something that could be called Russian Jewish literature, or Jewish Russian literature, as a literature written by Jews who are trying to prove something to the Russian literary culture, right? So the great poet, Russian poet, Osip Mandelstam, who was Jewish, there is a lot of scholarship about kind of trying to uncover the various Jewish themes in his poetry and try to understand his contribution to Russian language poetry through this Jewish lens, for example, right? So I'm not interested in adding to this conversation because I think what that approach does is it tries to disentangle the Russian from the Jewish or the Soviet from the Jewish, right? To try to think about how something is Jewish despite being Soviet or how something is Jewish despite being Russian. And instead, I really try to think about the Soviet Jew as a figure that is both the Jew and the Soviet, right? Where these two parts have equal weight, that exist in a productive tension between languages scattered across geographic and cultural landscapes. And I'm not trying to separate them, right? In my book, I'm really trying to understand how the two make one, the Soviet Jew. So let me give you a very quick sort of overview of what's kind of questions I ask in the book, and I'll do it as a way to kind of really ask questions. So Natan, if you don't mind the first slide. So what happens when Jews end up assaulted by multiple warring armies in the midst of post-revolution violence? The Soviet Jew is shaped by the trauma of the pogroms of the Russian Civil War is something that becomes a really important starting point for me. This happened mostly in Ukraine between 1918 and 1921, when tens of thousands of Jews perished in violence perpetrated by multiple sides. I think about this question with the help of David Bergelson's Yiddish novel Judgment, Midas Hadin in Yiddish, Midat Hadin for those of you who know Hebrew. And it's a text from 1920s, which I read. It's a text about the Soviet secret police and the border guards that guard the border of Ukraine, where Bolsheviks are trying to hold control and power, and Poland, which is now independent. And this border is very porous. It's full of smugglers, and it's also full of political agents who go back and forth. And it's right next to a shtetl, where Jews live and who are trying to adapt to the new reality. I read this novel as a Gothic text. A Gothic text with a central protagonist who is literally a physical monster or is distinguished by physical monstrosity. He is a border guard who has separating wounds on his neck and who strikes fear in people living in the shtetl nearby. The border post is set up in a decrepit monastery that's falling apart. These are classic tropes of Gothic novels from the 18th century. So I'm trying to think about the haunting that exists in that text when I put it in the conversation with other texts written at the time. So next slide. This is David Bergelsen, who was writing this novel in the late 1920s, he writes in Russian, but he writes in Yiddish, but he reads Russian. He writes his novel in Yiddish in the context when there are already many texts about Soviet secret police that had already been published, and many of them are written in this Gothic mode, right? Many of them have these kind of monstrous figures. So in many ways, his Yiddish language way to understand, right, how the Jews fit into the picture is in conversation with these texts, and they're also in conversation with the next slide, a whole bunch of other Soviet novels that are really important Soviet texts about the Civil War, about the Russian Civil War, that are all already written or in the process of being composed by the time he writes his Yiddish language novel. So that's sort of one question that I try to think about. And the haunting here is trying to understand this text that is dealing with Jews who are in the middle of violence that they don't know how it will end. Right? It's set in 1920, the end isn't clear, and he's trying to write about people who are afraid of the violence that they already witnessed coming back, if Bolsheviks don't hold power. So, next slide, please. So another question that I kind of ask myself in the book, what happens when a traditional multi-generational family, or more precisely a comically depicted one, exits its domicile on the outskirts of Minsk in Belarus, boards a brand new trolley that tethers their home to the expanding Soviet cities, and takes a ride to see a movie? This is a picture of a movie theater from Minsk. This is taken in 1932. You can tell that this is 1932 by the giant 15 in Latin letters on the awning, showing that it's the 15th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. And you can see train tracks in front. So this is the light rail that was built in this city with this movie theater in the center. So I think about the discourses of modernization, electricity, radio, the cinema, that create the new Soviet person, and think about how the Soviet Jew emerges in that context. About how living in a city that begins to grow and swallow sort of various districts that have been kind of almost exclusively Jewish, bringing them into the Soviet city produces this new cultural formation. Next picture, please. Thank you. Another question that I grappled with is what happens when an expedition is sent to Birobidzhan, the Jewish autonomous region in the Soviet Far East on the border of Manchuria, to study the USSR's claims that this region is a hospitable new environment for Soviet Jews to call their official home. Many people haven't heard about this place, right? There is, if you look at a detailed map of Russia to this day, you will see something called the Jewish autonomous region in the Far East on the border with China. This was set up in 1929 as a kind of official home for Soviet Jews. And I try to think about texts that imagine this place as becoming a Soviet Jewish homeland, but whenever they get to the place of needing to describe it, are always unable to do it, because the Soviet Jews never arrive in this wonderful new promised land in Siberia, right? They never make it, so non-arrival of Jews becomes the marker of the Soviet Jews that are imagined as being settled in that place. And I think about this with the help of a couple of writers who are obsessed with this question, and they write sketches, which is a kind of Soviet literary genre. They write novels, they write plays, they write children's books. So you see a cover of one children's book about the relocation of this family to Siberia. What happens when a one-time refugee from the Tsarist Empire returns to his native shtetl in what is by then Soviet Ukraine, now a refugee from American capitalism during the Great Depression? right? Because that's also a story, right? Lots of Jews had left the Russian Empire, right? So the ancestors of many American Jews had left before the revolution, and in the 1930s, some of them went back, right, during the Depression, and this is a story that was common enough to produce literature, to produce films. So I wonder about what the aspiration is for what the screenplay for one of the films made in 1932 calls a socially crippled freak. Right, this is what it says literally in Russian, социально искалеченный урод, somebody who is an ex-Russian Jew who had spent a couple of decades in America, has been crippled by capitalism, and now returns to the communist promised land to turn himself into a new Soviet man, which is a kind of Stalin-era idea of what a new Soviet person should be. But what if instead the new Soviet man fails to materialize and instead there is a Soviet Jew? So I do this with the help of a few films, including a film called The Return of Nathan Becker. And you can see this sort of the returning Russian-American Jew building a wall, which is a very Soviet kind of a trope of the Stalin-era cinema, but he's in the background of him as a poster, right, of this sort of muscular new Soviet man who is supposed to be something that he's not. So I try to think about that kind of relationship. And then finally, what does it mean that a trickster figure from Yiddish folklore, Hershele Astropolier, this trickster of many Yiddish stories, keeps showing up in the works of Isaac Babel, with whom I began this talk, over the course of the first 2 decades after 1917, and deal with several manifestations of revolutionary violence. So I try to write about probably the preeminent writer that people think of when they think about Soviet Jewish literature, Isaac Babel, and how his writing in Russian has this Yiddish in the background. This is a cover of there were many chapbooks collecting stories about, this trickster from Yiddish folklore that was published by an Odessa publisher. Isaac Babel grew up in Odessa. And I try to work with a version of the story that's in this text, assuming that this is roughly what Babel had access to, as he tries to rewrite them into the Soviet context. So this is kind of what I'm trying to think about. I'm a close reader of texts, so each chapter focuses on a central text or a central issue, occasionally represented by a smaller constellation of text. And then I go on a deep dive, often with the help of all sorts of other texts, to figure out where my main sources might lead me. So let me, within about kind of 10 minutes, walk you through 5 to 7 minutes, walk you through one of these examples to kind of give you a sense of what I'm trying to do. This is just the map. I wanted to give one example from my research and one example from what I tried to do in the book. I do it with the help of a novel by Moishe Kulbak, who was a really well-known Yiddish poet, who was became prominent in the city of Vilna, in what is now Lithuania, then lived a little bit in Berlin, and then ended up in Minsk, in Soviet Minsk, in 1926, joining his family that had been there for some time. And I think about the novel that he published serially between 1920 and 1935 called The Zelminyaners, which is available in the English translation, not by me, it's by Hillel Halkin, but I edited this edition. When I think about serialized novels, right, and this is a really great example, they are published in periodicals over a course of many years. And when they're published over a course of many years, they're published alongside other things that also appear in those periodicals, so you can understand the bigger cultural milieu in which a work of art or work of literature that we can now read between two covers appears in its original publication. So the first chapter of what would become a novel was published in December 1929 in the Yiddish publication called Stern, which means star, in Minsk, that was dedicated to the 50th birthday of Joseph Stalin, with his giant portrait and a congratulatory note from the editorial board underneath the portrait. And then it's facing the table of contents, right? That also, among other items, contains the first chapter for this novel that I'm writing about. So that's sort of one bit of context that I try to think about how a literary text participates in its historical environment. And another one is the context of Soviet Belarusia, of which Minsk is a capital, in the period that I write about, right, 1921 to 1937 or so, where there are 4 official languages at the time, and this is the state seal of Soviet Belarusia until 1937, with the Soviet slogan, "Proletarians of the world unite," written in 4 of those official languages, which are Belarusian, Russian, Polish, and Yiddish. Right? So this is a context when Yiddish is an official language of a Soviet republic with a really large Jewish population, but also with a lot of culture that's being produced in that context. So I deal with a family that lives kind of on the outskirts of town, and the city grows, right? And it grows through Soviet modernization projects. There's electricity, there's radio, and then there's a tram, and then there's a movie. So you can hear the bell of the tram outside their house, and then in the next chapter they board the tram and they go to see a movie. So this is the movie that they see. We have a description of it in the novel. It doesn't name it, but it gives us a sense of what it might be. It talks about Uncle Icha, who is a tailor, right? So I gave you a sense of hat makers in the beginning, but he's an artisan. So he goes to see this movie and he's very impressed, and Uncle Icha had to be content with reviewing in his mind all the ocean waters and all the polar bears that had appeared before him that magical evening in the cinema, right? So he can't get it out of his mind, and then late at night, stitching a pair of quilted pants, he thought with an aching heart about white bears and frozen travelers on icebergs, as people for whom such pants would be just the thing. Right? So he's developing some sense of empathy with the people that he saw in the movies, having gone to the movies for the first time. So what is this film, right? That was my question. I was like, what is it that they watch? And then I started reading the newspapers at the time, and as I was reading them to understand the broader context, I always read the announcements for the films, right? So when I was reading the daily newspapers in Minsk in 1929, you could get a sense that alongside with trams, electricity, and films, it was a city where cows were disappearing, and people would announce their disappearance in newspapers, right? So this modernization exists alongside a city that's still very much, like tied to this kind of agrarian life cycle. And at the same time as the announcements of cows disappearing, the city, and this is 1929 in the fall, when Kullback is beginning to write this novel, they write endless articles about the launching of the new tramway, which is, light rail. Endless articles. This is the biggest thing that the city has ever seen. So there are countless articles that begin to appear. So this is mid-October of 1929. And then we get an article in the same week, same day actually, about the opening of the tram line by the director of the trams, who writes about the advantages of having this wonderful thing in the city, and he especially points out how people who live on the outskirts of town can now make it into the center to go catch a play or a film, right? So this connection is being made between taking the tram and seeing a movie. And here's a lovely photo of Minsk at the time of a policeman kind of directing traffic in front of a tram. This is the movie theater that I showed you with train tracks in front of it, right? So it gives me kind of multiple points of connection. And then I'm reading, as I told you, announcements for movies. So this is an announcement for the same week when the tram begins operating. And my eye immediately goes to one item, right? So next slide. Right? What are they showing? They're showing Nanook of the North, right? They're seeing Nanook of the North, the famous film by Robert Flaherty, who was an ethnographer and an anthropologist, that was made in 1922, so several years before it had shown up in Minsk. and it was made in the Canadian Arctic, where he was filming the Inuit. And there is, I mean, I don't have time, I go into this in depth in the chapter. There's a lot of scholarship about this film, right? And how it was for a long time thought to be the first documentary ever made, which is not true. But also kind of later scholars come to understand it as creating this sort of practice of salvage ethnography, of where, you know, a Western person, a white person, goes into some native habitat and tries to document it as it's disappearing, but as he's documenting it, he's preserving it as though it still existed, right? So he is, Robert Flaherty, for example, asks Nanook to hunt with a harpoon, even though Nanook is already using guns, right? So he's trying to get him to reenact some earlier practice of his culture so that he can show, right, on celluloid to his viewers in the movie theater the way that this native culture is, right? So it's trying to salvage something that's in the process of disappearing, and in the disappearance of which the movie maker himself is complicit, right? So the story about Flaherty is that his camera was too big, as cameras were at the time, to fit in an igloo where Nanook lived. So how do you fit it in? You shave off half of the igloo and you put the camera there, exposing the family to the elements, right? So your kind of modernization that is itself complicit in the destruction that you're then trying to document. So why am I dwelling on this, right? What is the connection for me? The connection is that Moishe Kulbak, the author of this novel at the time, clearly went to see Nanook. I mean, I have no doubt, right, that he is writing a novel that he, you know, it's really sort of a lot of things from Minsk are embedded in it. But he has a day job at the time. And his day job, he's a poet, he's a writer, but his day job is that he is an editor. And what does he edit? He is editing, he's a stylistic editor of the publications of the Belarusian Academy of Sciences that has a Jewish department, right? And remember the state seal, Yiddish is an official language in Soviet Belarusia. The Belarusian Academy of Sciences produces a ton of publications in Yiddish. And what kinds of publications are these? These are ethnographic studies of shtetl Jews, right, of Jews who are in the form of Pale of Settlement in the present. Why are they interested in studying them? Because they want to understand how to best turn them into Soviet people, right? So they need to try to, so there's this kind of official ethnography that is being produced in order to understand how to Sovietize people. Kulbak is editing that in his official capacity by day, and by night is writing a parody, right, of a novel that's a comic novel in which this ethnographic language becomes a point of resistance to the Sovietizing project. So he ends up sort of caricaturing a lot of this language, and he invents this family. Let's do a couple of slides. Yep, there we go. Go back. That lives in this contained space of a courtyard. In Yiddish, it's Hof. In Russian, it's Dvor. This kind of self-contained unit where the family is kind of living that gets swallowed up by the Soviet city. So what do we have in the end, right? To kind of to wrap up this this example. One more. Thank you. This novel begins, so it's serialized in 1929, it ends in 1935. Lots and lots of things happen in Soviet history and Soviet culture between 1929 and 1935. 1929 is the first year when Stalin is firmly in control of the state. By the mid-1930s, we get into high Stalinism and the beginning of repressions and purges. And the kind of political, you know, kind of strengthening of central power. The novel begins in its first chapter that was already published in 1929 with this lovely scene that takes place clearly in the future. Right? It describes this family called the Zelminyaners. They're Zelminyaners because they have a progenitor named Zalman, and Zelminyaner are his progeny. That's kind of how they get their name. And it talks about a traveler on a train who recognizes a member of that clan by smell. right? And that this Jew kind of rattles on, and the novel tells us that the Zalminyaners have developed their own distinct traits in all kinds of ways, including a smell, right? So it uses this ethnographic language, or the parody of the ethnographic language, to talk about this family as a kind of paradigmatic Soviet Jews that are now traveling on trains. They're probably displaced from their family, from the courtyard at this point, but they're somewhere else, but they still carry something with them, right? So going back to the quote with which I started, Isaac Babel's heap of rags, right? People who are kind of leaving one place and are circulating throughout the country, the new country that's changing in a different way, still carrying some kind of a sense to them that is other from what the country wants them to become, was really, really important for me. The conventional way, like, of reading the end of that story is that it all ends, right? It all ends in the war. There's Holocaust. There is repressions. Later, after the war, the repressions against Jewish culture. But the protagonists of my book don't know that that's coming, right? They might sense it. But I'm trying to write a book about texts written at the time when that end isn't necessarily predetermined, right? Not because that end isn't important in its own way, but I'm trying to understand it as it's still unraveling, trying to understand how people living at the time engage with that culture. So one might say that something like this, a new Soviet building growing in place of a kind of Jewish families living place, is how that story ends, and it does, right? But I'm trying to rewind the time a little bit to try to get us in the place where we can understand the way that this culture is evolving and the way that the Soviet Jew comes into being. So thank you all, and I think we have about 15 minutes for questions or so. I'll put this up there. If you want a book, there's some available, and there are instructions on how to get them. And I'm happy to sign them too. So.
The floor is open for questions. I can actually hear you.
From your talk, I understand you speak Yiddish. That's part of your translation. How did you learn Yiddish? What's the story behind that?
In graduate school. I didn't speak it growing up or anything like that. So, when I went to graduate school and realized that this was sort of the topic I wanted to work on, that I needed to, Russian as a native language was my native language, but that I really needed Yiddish to be able to read things properly. So I think that's really there isn't some great, nobody spoke Yiddish to me in childhood. So, yeah.
Very interesting lecture. What happened when the Pale of Settlement dissolved? One day it was up, and the next day it was down, or how long did it take for the Pale of Settlement to be pointed out?
Well, there isn't like a protected border around the place that you need to climb over, right, to go leave it, right? Once it doesn't exist as a legal entity, it's not being enforced, right? The Pale was about residence restrictions, right? So Jews who lived in the Pale could not settle in major cities, including inside the Pale, with some exceptions, and could not live, outside the Pale in other parts of the Russian Empire. So once it's all about kind of carrying internal documents that show where you're from and who you are. And so once that doesn't exist, right, you're not tethered to a place. So I think that's really nobody comes around and it's not the Berlin Wall, right? Nobody takes it apart. So I think that's it's a kind of imaginary line that is gone, right? And people can live anywhere they can, and many do. So.
This question kind of betrays my ignorance. I want to build on your very amusing story about the Zalminyaner.
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 think of Zalman and then like add a suffix. Yeah.
That have this distinctive,
Uh-huh.
So can you say today that the Soviet Jews have this distinctive element? What I mean is, do they have that residue, the cultural residue?
I mean, I think it's, so I was, I had a lovely conversation yesterday with this person over here, Lev Gringaus, who is a journalist for TC Jewfolk. Am I saying this right? Whom we know each other from Twitter. So I know the Bathman from Twitter and I know Lev from Twitter. But we met in real life, IRL, yesterday. And Lev was born in, sorry, I'm now telling you a story, but was born in Minneapolis to parents who were immigrants as children from the Soviet Union to the States. So we had the kind of a version of this conversation yesterday, right? And I think it's a question to which I would love for people who are not me to give an answer, maybe in relationship to my book, right? Does my thinking about, let's say, the beginning of that distinctive smell, right, its origin point at the beginning of the Soviet period, does it resonate with people of a much later vintage, right, who trace their roots to this Soviet Jew that comes into existence at the time that I write about? I mean, the answer is yes, right? But what that is a separate story, right? And it exists in some relationship to what I'm trying to describe in the book. That's why I joked, if I write a sequel, right? Like, that's the question I might ask. But this is, I don't know if I can be qualified to give you a whole palette, right? Of what's the right range for smells to kind of properly answer your question, other than to say that sort of my hope is, right, that people who come from that background, who study people who are Soviet Jews or war-born Soviet Jews, kind of think about this book as trying to map out the beginning of that story or remap it in some ways and then kind of follow it through, right, to the wartime period, post-war, the Cold War, and then the immigration to different places. So I think that's sort of my answer.
So I was intrigued at the beginning, or near the beginning of your talk, you distinguished your approach from others who attempt to separate or to distinguish between those who the Jewish traits versus the Russian traits and how to disentangle them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was very interested to see that you took a different approach. But I'd like to understand a little bit better what we learn from your approach as against those separated and distinguished.
It's a great question. Thank you. And right, this is and I get into this in different places in the book, right? So this is the kind of more kind of scholarly stakes. I think I wouldn't necessarily answer it the same way when I started writing the book, but now the war in Ukraine is on my mind, right? So the book was already in press when Russia invaded. I asked the press whether I could write a new foreword or something like that, and I couldn't. There's nothing I would rethink in the book. I stand behind how I thought about it, but the answer to this question is different. I think a lot of the stakes of people who are trying to understand Russian Jewish literature, right? And it's kind of emphasizing literature or cultural production, is something about proving the contribution of Jews to the Russian culture, right? And I am not interested in that question. And the way that I said it in the lecture is because I don't think I have anything to add to this discussion, right? And that discussion adding would be discovering yet another clever Jewish trope in some canonical Russian writer of Jewish origins and saying, look what he snuck into this, great culture. But with the war on my mind, I think there's maybe an additional point, right? Is how maybe that kind of approach is itself produced by this imperial anxiety. The pull of the Russian language as the language of the empire, right? That produces, that tries to homogenize different peoples who don't necessarily speak that language in its own way, and then you kind of find bits and pieces of their other heritage, right, as contribution to this kind of great vortex of Russian culture. And I'm not sure that I'm prepared to fully think through that. I think that's the sort of critical piece to write next, right? But somewhere on my mind is that question, right? I wasn't interested in this to begin with, but I think I'm maybe now understanding why I wasn't, right? So in a sense, I'm interested in taking as a given, right, that the Russian language, and for me Russian language is a language of state power in the Soviet period, would exert this pressure, right? And I'm interested in writers, filmmakers, etc., who are thinking about it as a kind of a hybrid, right? And are not trying to resist it, are not trying to push it away, but instead they produce some kind of a thing that isn't proving anything to the Russians. It's not proving anything to the bigger kind of important nationality, but instead is trying to understand what the experience of Soviet Jews might actually be, given that set of circumstances. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm still thinking through this, right? I didn't write about Ukraine in the book, but it's kind of, I think it's shapes my impression right now. So, great question.
I think there were another couple of hands.
Thank you for the superb lecture. It was tremendously interesting. So to probably to continue from the previous question, the position of Black himself, and you bring in this pretty extraordinary comparison with the American ethnographer and the Inuits and the Jews. So, I mean, his position, he is an ethnographer and he is the Inuit.
Yeah.
He finds himself as
The subject-object.
Yeah, so it's an extremely forced position.
Yeah.
So from what you understand, from how you feel the text, what the motivations are on his side, how he writes through it, sort of, and even the appearance of the smell. So what is behind this posed feature, which would never exist? But what was how you feel at this point in time that this young man found himself to be this ethnographer and the ethnographed?
No, it's a great question. And so again, my pitch would be, I really hope that people read the novels themselves, because they're wonderful texts, right, that now exist in the English translation. Zelminyan also exists in the Russian translation. That's very good, and I can write to you about that later. The Russian translation is better if you can read Russian. So, yeah, I think it's a question that's central in his mind, and I write about this in the book. The book doesn't have a central protagonist, but the one with whom I think he's closest is among the younger generation of people in this family who was born possibly just before the revolution, or maybe a few years before, but really comes to maturity already in the post-revolutionary period. And that character, whose name is Tsalke, and you, of course, as a material culture person, and I write about this in the book too. Tsalke is short for Tzalel, so he is Bezalel. He becomes the ethnographer in the novel, who collects tidbits of the culture, right? So he goes and hangs out with the old people in the family, and he writes down their words. There are lists that he makes of vocabulary words that he heard at the market but hasn't yet figured out what they mean, right? In Yiddish, right? So this kind of, language of the butchers or whatever. And the running joke with him is that he keeps committing suicide. Many times until he succeeds at the end. I mean, I don't want to spoil the text, but you can kind of see where this is going. It's a comic novel, right? So his suicide becomes, running attempts at suicide become a joke, right? But then he actually dies. So I think through this Tzalke Tzalel B'Tzalel, he's constructing the novel itself, and he writes, at some point there's a chapter called Zelminyade, or the Zelminayad, which is Tzalel's own ethnographic study of his family, right? Which is a parody of the official text that Kulbak edits. There's a way, I think, to think about with that, about how the novel that he writes becomes a kind of mishkan, right? Becomes a kind of collection into which he's shoving in not just the culture as it was, right? Because that's Flaherty's perspective. He's trying to depict on screen something that he claims still exists, even though it's in the process of becoming less existing, right? Flaherty erases from his film his own role as the introducer of modernization that then deletes the specificity of this culture. Kulbak, I think, in contrast, is interested both in what there was that could be depicted via these documents and the process of change, right? So I think he's interested in cataloging, right, the attributes of the Soviet Jew that, kind of are called the Soviet Jew, in something in the novel, right? And the novel itself is full of traces of that effort, right? So that to me is kind of the way that he writes through this. And we can then go to it as a kind of almost like archaeological site, right? And try to think about how, and I hope that I showed you kind of some of the way in which I do it, right? How to disentangle it, but it itself becomes the container, right? That sort of has things. So.
We'll do one last question.
Great question. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much for what you presented, which is very based in language. I'm going to bring up a personality that doesn't fit exactly into your time frame, but it's very concerned with Soviet Jewry, but it's not language-based. And that's the choreographer Boris Yakovsky, who's dealing specifically with Soviet Jewry in his work. And there are artists who are also doing this, like Chagall.
Of course.
And these to me stand for these issues you're talking about, but it's beyond language.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's also theater, right? And I have colleagues who work on theater, including on Soviet Yiddish theater. There's Mikhoels, yeah, Mikhoels shows up because he's in a couple of films that I write about, right? So he shows up as a film actor. There's, of course, visual culture. So I think it's the question is, what can I do? It's already kind of a long book, right? So, like, what can I do that I am qualified to do well enough to give people? So I'm not trying to, this is what I try to kind of show you in my talk. I'm not trying to, I don't think it's possible to be exhaustive. And also books that try to be exhaustive are sometimes impossible to read because they become kind of catalogs of names and plot points and they're useful, right? There's a place for those kinds of books and they're really helpful for me to work with so that I can take, and I have some colleagues who write books like this, right? I can take a page from their book and I can make it into a chapter, right? I can see the spark for something that they wrote about. I'm just not that kind of writer. I can't be exhaustive that way. I'm trying to be a close reader, right? I want to try to write these kind of case histories, I guess, case studies that have a central question in them. And hopefully, right, if you think about, I mean, I'm just told you that I don't know about visual arts, and here I'm going to make a terrible, painting metaphor because I don't know how to paint, right? But if I were to be working with a canvas that I was beginning in one end and then not sure where I was going with that and starting from another side and then kind of working towards the middle, and then suddenly you kind of see something that comes around, but I'm not painting it in some kind of logical progression to somebody who might be looking. So I'm kind of hoping that with the chapters that I have, some picture emerges, right? From a point here, a point there, a point there, some way of mapping this phenomenon, which is by no means, right, an attempt to be exhaustive here. So, yeah.